Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Diana Nguyen. I'm working with the Central Land Council, and I'm here to chair this afternoon's session, the third session of the day. The title of this afternoon's session is Measuring Damage and Loss in Aboriginal Australia, a comparative approach to sacred site damage issues as indicators of loss in native title compensation matters. And the presenter for this session is Gareth Lewis. I'll just give a brief background to Gareth and a little bit of a summary on what he'll be presenting on today, and then I'll hand over to Gareth. So Gareth is a consultant anthropologist with more than 20 years of applied experience across Australia's Northern Territory, covering Aboriginal land rights, sacred site protection, and native title matters. Gareth's worked extensively at the interface between Aboriginal peoples, governments, parks, agencies, the mining industry and other developers, and has held various roles, including as senior anthropologist at both the Northern Land Council and the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. He's worked on Aboriginal land claims, native title claims, co-management of parks, and numerous major mining and other development projects. He's also undertaken numerous sacred site field surveys, sacred site registrations, and has been involved in investigations and prosecutions for offences under the Northern Territory's Aboriginal Sacred Sites Act. So today, Gareth proposes to draw upon this vast experience, and particularly his experiences of dealing with the processes of loss involved in cases of site damage in the Northern Territory, to examine cultural loss at this severe scale. He will argue the need to examine and understand Aboriginal discourses of impact and internal laws and processes of compensation, rather than imparting Western concepts of value, loss, and change. He seeks to review the language of loss, get behind the often inadequate and clumsy translations and tropes, in order to examine what really happens at the individual and societal level. What are the processes of shame and reputational damage? What are the physical and psychological risks? What are the temporary and enduring transformations to social behaviour? What happens to the reproduction of culture and society? So, thanks, Gareth. Over to you.
Thanks, Diane. Hi, everyone from Darwin. So, fairly sunny but hot and sticky day up here. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge Larrakia owners of this country and their elders past, present and emerging. Yeah, that's a fairly ambitious title and perhaps an ambitious opening, but I'll just do what I can in terms of, I've got 20 minutes or so to run through a presentation and some writing on these ideas. Perhaps not all the answers, but hopefully lots of ideas and some thoughtful discussion. So really, I guess during 2021, in April, I was fortunate to spend about 3 weeks in Canberra as a Centre for Native Title Anthropology guided writing placement scholar. I was locked in a moon boot and had crutches at the time as a result of a self-inflicted football injury. So I greatly appreciated being spoilt to death by the delightful Julie Finlayson, who picked me up from the airport, gave me lifts, hosted me for dinner and breakfast with hubby David, and most importantly, introduced me to the many fineries of the Dixon IGA and adjacent bottle shop. Julie appropriately chastised my wine selection, not on the label, but rather on the volume. She said, surely you're going to need more than that. So anyway, I enjoyed that 3 weeks of scholarly thinking during the placement, away from work, but reflecting on the issues that I've encountered throughout my working career in the Northern Territory. I enjoyed the access to the ANU library and its online portals, and enjoyed bouncing ideas off and drafting an outline sort of proposal for a working paper or publication off of Julie and Professor Nick Peterson. I also had various rewarding conversations, especially with Di Smith, whose 2001 paper on valuing native title, Aboriginal statutory and policy discourses about compensation resonated with my thinking, and as did a recording on the CNTO website. So this is the first opportunity I've had to start, I guess, present some of the ideas based on that placement. So it's all a bit rough and ready still. But as the sort of title and abstract suggest, I'm trying to focus here on what I've experienced with working on sacred site damage matters in the NT, and how sort of impacts of such damage may assist us in our anthropological thinking about cultural loss. And of course, how this then hopefully can then be applied to legal processes of seeking compensation for cultural loss, which is obviously an emerging and burgeoning aspect of post-determination native title practice. I've had no direct experience in compensation in the native title arena to date, but my insights are more gained from writing successful connection reports and working on determinations, our land claims, as well as the various court matters I've worked on in terms of investigations and compensation matters for sacred site damage or desecration. I guess I used the 3 weeks in Canberra was really an opportunity to dig through as much of the existing library material as I could, and really returning to the iconic texts of our of esteemed predecessors, such as the Burnts, Elkin, Hyatt, and Stanner. And really, I was really seeking to, I guess, test and review my experiences against the writings of these former greats in our discipline. And as I expected, I rediscovered the preeminence that these authors gave to the cosmology of Aboriginal people and their spiritual connections to the land, as exemplified in sort of this quote which Adele could try and put up. It's the first one from Ronald Burnt, from his 1970 paper, The Sacred Site, the West Arnhem Land Example. And that's basically saying that the land is personified in shape-changing mythic beings, creators not of the primordial land itself, which was given, but of much which came to be in that land. I'll let you read the rest of the quote. This sort of almost biblical sounding quote from Ronald Burnt sets the scene for what an Aboriginal sacred site signifies. Now, it was this sort of descriptive material which he brought to the fore along with the evidence of the Yolngu plaintiffs in the Gove land rights case. And this in turn then set the tone for the Woodward land rights inquiry and ultimately saw Aboriginal spirituality enshrined in the definition of traditional Aboriginal ownership in the Northern Territory Land Rights Act. A definition which requires local descent groups to be localised within the landscape through a primary spiritual responsibility for the land, usually articulated via sacred sites. This, of course, has shaped the legislative schema and anthropological writing since, especially in the native title era. My applied career has afforded me the opportunity to visit, map and record a vast array of sacred sites, especially across the northern half of the NT. Sadly, much of this work has involved cases where sites have been offended, damaged or destroyed by various actions and causes. This work has involved the recording of both physical damage to sites, as well as documenting and attempting to translate the experience and impacts of that damage for owners and custodians. So really, I guess in my view, cases of site damage offer a benchmark where cultural loss is arguably at its most devastating and incomprehensible. It is simultaneously where cultural loss is at its most keenly felt and articulated, at least inwardly within Aboriginal societies, but also where pathways towards remediation and recompense are at their most complex and difficult. Damage and its impacts are articulated and internalised both by individuals and by groups, and are codified by and managed within the normative framework of laws and customs which the impacted individuals and groups identify with and respond to. So critical here is the sense that sacred sites play an intrinsic and constitutive role in the personal and intergenerational embodiment of a society and in the ability of that society to sustain and reproduce itself. I explored this with Dr. Ben Scambry in our 2016 book chapter in Pam McGrath's volume on the right to protect sites. So a key problem to me is that such fundamentals remain poorly understood and interpreted by the outside world, presenting a massive challenge in the consideration of compensation in the native title arena. The recently released New South Wales Value Generals report, which has been on the CNTO website, on compensation value for native title, says that compensation amounts should be intuitive, fair and just to the Australian community. And this begs the question, how can the Australian community understand what are fair and just terms in compensating for cultural losses in a context they know nothing about, or cannot comprehend? The literature and other materials surrounding compensation law and native title are emerging. Much material is available on the CNTO website, with web presentations available from last year's conference, with Courtney Bogue's excellent discussion with Sturt Glack and Wendy Ash and Mick O'Kane, as well as early materials, including recordings from Dave Martin and Justin Mansfield. And I know that Wendy's presenting on Friday, and we've had a chat the other day about the commonality of our experiences and some of the matters we'll talk about. I guess, of course, so much has grown from the 2016 federal court findings on the compensation matters in Timber Creek. And I guess, and Pam McGrath, I think she urges us to, we have to turn our minds to the shadow side of survival, which is loss. But a particular note, I guess, is that Justice Mansfield's orders, when he ordered the compensation figure of 1.3 million for non-economic loss, was in response to the claims for diminution or disruption in traditional attachment to country and the loss of rights to live on and gain spiritual and material sustenance from the land. The analogy was given of the priceless painting with holes in it. And this was given, and this sort of analogy was discussed by Wendy last year in her video. There's another quote which Adele could put up, the next one from Stanner. In his 1968 Boyer lecture, Professor Stanner recognised the problem of intercultural translation, as we all do. And there's a sort of a nice sort of way of putting it all together into a long quote. But in particular, it's the last sentence that sort of sticks in my brain. A different tradition leaves us tongueless and earless towards this other world of meaning and significance. Di Smith warned us in her work that we need to bring in and recognise Aboriginal laws and values regarding compensation rather than imparting Western concepts of value and loss and change. She notes that we need to do this. A new language is required in order to avoid compensation nullius. I'll come back to that. Last year's Centre for Native Title Anthropology presentation and the video included a really good point from Mick O'Kane, who asked the question, have we developed the language as anthropologists in which we can talk about or help Aboriginal people talk about the effects of trauma and loss on themselves, their families, their cultural practices and their identity? He also asked how we can do this without risking weaponising these texts against the social continuity requirements of connection reporting. I agree completely that language and effective translation of Aboriginal constructions of loss, change and compensation are now critical. It presents as a massive challenge for anthropologists now to render our legal system and arguably our broader society literate to an Indigenous discourse of loss, to not only hear and record the words, the tears, the howls of hurt, but to get behind the often useless and at best clumsy translations of tangible pain and grief, which do easily become tropes, to access what really happens at the individual and societal level. In my experience, it's been relatively easy to sit down and listen to and gather words into a witness or victim impact statement from custodians or owners of sacred sites that have been damaged. And I'm sure we've all heard or read words which attempt to translate by Aboriginal people their concepts of loss, damage and hurt into forms accessible to us in English. Catchphrases like this makes me feel sick, it gives me no good bingy, it makes me sad and shamed, it breaks my spirit. Whilst these are valuable, they're also incredibly ambiguous and understated words, which are seeking to explain the incomprehensible. After all, how does one describe what may be tantamount to the destruction of one's social and spiritual universe? These translations inadvertently and tragically mask the experience of bodily pain, grief, processes of shame, reputational damage, and ruptures to transformations of social behaviour. How can such words hope to convey the scope of physical, spiritual and psychological damage? How can the threats to the ability of a group to reproduce their very culture and society be easily conveyed? How do we measure what younger generations are starting to think in relation to these sorts of things? How do they relate to the values of their elders? How do the elders themselves maintain their own beliefs, let alone promote such beliefs relating to the pervasive and normative powers of dreamings, creation ancestors, when outsiders can come in and tear down inviolable sites, sorry. So as anthropologists, I guess we need to understand and get behind that, the emotive side, in order to be able to articulate impacts and their associated social processes in a professional manner. Again, I look back to some of the classical Australian anthropology in which understandings of Aboriginal sacred sites have demonstrated that sites are constitutional not only of belief systems, but also of social and territorial organisation. The literature and our experience demonstrates how the holistic nature of the Aboriginal world makes it so difficult to separate and consider elements in isolation or in an institutional sense. Again, this is what was picked up by Mansfield in noting the analogy to the painting with the holes in it. How am I going for time, Adele? Sorry, I can't hear. But anyway, I'll keep going.
Sorry, yeah, 10 minutes, sorry.
No worries, good. So religious thought and practice in Aboriginal society can be generalised as based on life-giving fertility powers of creation ancestors which are engaged with via ritual and ceremony. There is a balance of power within the social and spiritual worlds where the performance of ritual and ceremony ensures fertility and the perpetuation of life and ensures the continuity of society and its spiritual sustenance. There's another quote from Ronald Burnt here from 1951 where he's talking about that, this sort of ancestral power. So this spiritual power or essence of the creative forces is embodied and personalised, yet detached through the individual's life cycle. It also grounds both the individual and groups within the landscape and the territories and validated by particular ancestral connections at sacred sites. So damage to these sites creates an imbalance of this power. It disrupts the social as well as the spiritual realms. Regardless of causality, it places owners as Kiera or Nimiringi, or whichever language we use, into conflict with managers, the Kurunguru or the Jungai. It challenges social order and can even disrupt the ability to reproduce society itself. It's also the discrediting of this power when acts of damage or destruction occur. It's as if the power or the Dal or the Jung or whichever language you choose to use is challenged and it's shown to be ineffectual against non-Aboriginal people's forms of physical, legal, corporate power. Again, these are dominant themes I discussed with Ben Scambry in our 2016 chapter. There are many examples that I could draw upon, but I'll try and focus on really on one, and then perhaps we can end up talking about some more in discussion afterwards. But I guess one of the biggest case that I worked on was the Booty Creek prosecution for the manganese mine north of Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. Thanks, Adele, well prompted. Where a mining company was convicted in 2013 for desecration and some other offences under the Northern Territory Aboriginal Sacred Sites Act. The company spent over $1 million fighting the court case and ultimately was found convicted and fined a total of $150,000, regardless of the seriousness of the convictions. And these fines didn't go to the community. They went to NT Revenue. In working on this matter, so I guess some familiar sort of issues emerged, and you know, I think again that they link back to some of what Wendy and I spoke about the other day. In court statements, one of the custodians described the impact of the site destruction as akin to the ripping out of a page of an inherited book. The narrative is rendered broken, senseless, and unable to be transmitted to the next generation, leaving a permanent gap in the narrative and the tradition. Again, this is highly reflective of the Timber Creek analogy of the special painting with holes in it. Also, in the Booty Creek case, there was a Northern Land Council regional officer employed at Tennant Creek who organised an ill-fated mine inspection with traditional owners, which the company incorrectly assumed was a decision in their favour to undercut the sacred site. This officer died of cancer within months of the incident, again similar to the caravan park owner at Timber Creek who died soon after concreting over the dreaming site. This was seen and accepted as the retributive power of the dreaming. There's been a more recent death at the mine site, which I assume, and I haven't spoken to people about it, but I assume would be treated in a similar sort of way. I think there was a wall collapse in the mine and a guy was killed in he was operating at the bottom of the pit. But probably more, and beyond those sort of things, that I guess custodians describe the changes to social relationships and behaviours, the fights between friends, the changes in drinking behaviours, and the attribution of unusual environmental events such as floods and fires to the site damage. Also, the site damage reignited earlier disputes around contested succession to the mine, with disgruntled claimants who hadn't been recognised as owners citing the damage as proof that the recognised successors were the wrong people, arguing that this supported the validity of their own claims. And on top of all that, one of the key custodians who gave evidence became very ill and spent a lot of time relocating away from Tennant Creek to Adelaide for a whole range of health issues, which again, I'm sure that person and family and community would attribute back to the same sort of events. Despite the sort of landmark convictions in this case, in 2013, the community is still seeking to finalise a confidential compensation deed which has been negotiated with the NLC. I worked on this process. We saw the company attend a very fiery meeting of traditional owners in Tennant Creek a number of years ago. The hostility the company representative and his lawyer received in response to a read statement of apology was completely lost on them. Visibly shaken in the corridor during the break, I responded to their confusion. They asked me, why the hostility? We were convicted, we paid our fine, we've said sorry, we want to move ahead. So I explained to these guys that the man leading the hostility against them in the meeting is the man being held accountable for the damage by his community. Despite everyone knowing full well that the company did the damage, he is the one that's holding the can. I explained that he must be seen to be punishing the company, not ARPA or AAP, the Aboriginal Restriction Authority, not the courts. It needs to be him. And he needs to do this in order to fulfill his responsibilities to the site, to regain his respect amongst his peers and restore social harmony. In response, the company asked for a written explanation of this process, which was prepared through the NLC. This was taken to a company board meeting, and very, very shortly afterwards, a sizable but confidential compensation amount was offered to the traditional owners and custodians. And we're still trying to sort out that deed of agreement, because it's actually in itself has caused a whole range of issues of what to do with the money and then who gets the money, and so a whole range of other issues. Before concluding, if I have got a bit more time, I'll
Sorry, Gareth, you've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes
okay.
left.
All right, well, I'll leave that one, and I'll just jump to my concluding comments, I guess. So returning to Stanner, who says a different tradition leaves us tongueless and earless towards this other world of meaning and its significance. The attempted Aboriginal translations of damage and cultural loss for European ears are in themselves a worthy topic of research. Within those translations, undoubtedly are sociolinguistic historiographic elements reflecting the power relationships of the colonial past, as well as the more ethnographically common difficulties found normally with translation. I believe we need to look deeper at Booter Creek, at Numbulwar, at Brum Jungle, at Coronation Hill, at Juukan Gorge, whatever case of site damage you may wish to pull up. Because in there we can discern processes of damage acting like ripples, slowly moving through the affected communities, taking their toll. Compensation in this sense is about process as well as amount. It's about undoing social rupture and harm for Aboriginal people within their own frameworks. Our ability to describe this process and what's going on is critical. We should not risk underselling the value of loss in the compensation sphere by being caught misrepresenting or failing to adequately represent the meaning behind the words. And this is my agreement with Di Smith's warning of compensation alias and my answer to Mick O'Kane's question from last year. While we may have well started the process, the answer is really no. We have not yet developed the language as anthropologists to talk about and assist Aboriginal people to talk effectively about the effects of trauma and loss on themselves and their societies. Thanks.